Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are going to talk about ancient China. Not the emperors and their wars, not the great dynasties rising and falling, not the battles or the political intrigues, or the dramatic moments of history that fill the pages of textbooks. Tonight, we are going to talk about something much quieter and much more permanent than any of those things. We are going to talk about buildings, the way a wall was built, the way a roof was constructed, timber by timber, fitted together with a precision that required no nails and no glue, only wood shaped carefully against wood, held by its own weight and by the intelligence of the craftsman who designed it. We are going to talk about the way a foundation was laid, how earth was rammed down layer by layer until it became almost as hard as stone. We are going to talk about the slow, patient, enormously skilled work of the people who built ancient China, not the rulers who ordered the buildings, but the workers and craftsmen who actually made them. There is something deeply calming about the idea of construction done slowly and deliberately. A wall rising one brick at a time, a beam being lifted into place with ropes and pulleys and the coordinated effort of many hands. A roof tile being set, adjusted, set again. These are not hurried activities. They are patient ones. And patience in great quantities is what built ancient China. So settle in. Let your body become heavy. Let your breath slow. And let us begin very quietly with the earth itself. Before a single stone was moved or a single timber was cut, the builders of ancient China spent a great deal of time simply looking at the land. The practice of geomancy known in China as feng shui, which means wind and water, was taken very seriously. The position of a building in relation to the landscape around it was considered as important as the building itself. A site that was sheltered from the north by hills or high ground that faced south toward the warmth of the sun, that had water nearby but not so close as to flood. This was a good site. A site exposed to harsh northern winds, or backed against a sharp cliff, or positioned at the confluence of difficult terrain. This was not the people responsible for choosing a site would walk the land slowly. They would observe where the morning light fell. They would notice where the wind came from and how it moved across the ground. They would look at the quality of the soil, its color, its texture, its smell when turned up with a tool. Dark, rich soil was promising. Gray, thin soil was not. Soil that held moisture well was better than soil that dried out quickly. They would look at the plants growing naturally on the site, because plants do not lie about the conditions of the ground beneath them. Certain plants suggested good drainage. Others suggested underground water. Others suggested poor soil that would not support a heavy structure well. All of this observation happened slowly, over days or sometimes weeks before any decision was made. The site had to be right, because once a building was constructed, it was meant to last not for years, but for generations. The care taken in choosing the site was the first act of construction, and it was considered just as important as any of the acts that followed. Preparing the ground once a site had been chosen, the ground had to be prepared. The first task was clearing. Any vegetation, grass, shrubs, small trees was cut down and removed. Roots were dug out. Rocks were lifted and carried away. The surface of the ground was stripped back to bare earth. Then the leveling began. Ancient Chinese builders were skilled at creating level surfaces on ground that was not naturally flat. They used water filling a shallow channel or trench with water and observing where the surface of the water touched the edges. Water, being perfectly level by nature, revealed where the ground was high and where it was low. Earth was removed from the high places and added to the low ones, gradually bringing the whole area to an even plane. This leveling was slow work. A large building platform might take many days to level precisely. The workers moved earth in baskets carried on shoulder poles, a method that would have been familiar across many centuries of Chinese construction. 2 baskets, one at each end of a flexible bamboo pole, resting on one shoulder, the weight balanced by the slight spring of the bamboo. The worker carried this load with a particular gait, a slight bouncing step that matched the rhythm of the pole's flex, making the load easier to carry than it would be if held rigidly. Back and forth, back and forth. Earth removed, earth added. The ground slowly becoming level. The sun moving across the sky. The sound of earth being tipped from baskets, the quiet shuffle of feet. The occasional exchange of words between workers. Rammed earth. The foundation of most ancient Chinese buildings was not stone, and it was not poured concrete. It was rammed earth, a building material so simple and so effective that it has been used in China for thousands of years and is still used in some parts of the world today. Rammed earth begins as ordinary soil, but it is soil that has been carefully selected, the right mixture of clay, sand, and silt, with just enough moisture in it to compact well, but not so much that it stays soft. Too much clay, and the earth would crack as it dried. Too much sand, and it would not bind well. The right mixture produced a material that, when rammed, became almost like stone. The ramming was done in thin layers. Earth was spread across the foundation area to a depth of perhaps 3 or 4 inches. Then it was rammed workers using heavy wooden pestles, flat at the bottom, brought down firmly and repeatedly onto the loose earth, compressing it, driving out the air, forcing the particles tightly together. The sound of ramming was a deep, rhythmic thudding. Many workers, side by side, their pestles rising and falling together, or in a staggered rhythm, the sound filling the air around the building site with a low, repetitive percussion. The earth beneath the pestles gradually darkened and compacted, its surface becoming firmer with each blow. When one layer was fully rammed, another thin layer of earth was added on top, and the process was repeated. Layer by layer, the foundation grew in height and in density. A rammed earth platform for a significant building might be several feet high, composed of dozens of individual rammed layers, each one compressed into a band perhaps an inch or 2 thick in the finished work. The finished rammed earth platform was dense and hard. It would not absorb water easily. It would not shift or settle unevenly. It provided a stable, level surface on which the building could be constructed, and it would last for a very long time. Some rammed earth foundations from ancient China are still intact today. After 2,000 years or more, dot stone foundations and column bases on top of the rammed earth platform. Stone was used for the critical points where the wooden columns of the building would stand. Wood and wet earth do not coexist well. If a wooden column is set directly into the earth, moisture will enter the base of the column over time, and rot will begin slowly at first, then more quickly until the column is compromised. Ancient Chinese builders understood this very well, and they addressed it with a simple and elegant solution. At each point where a column would stand, a flat stone was set into the top of the rammed earth platform. These column bases, called chu, were usually made from hard stone, sometimes granite, sometimes limestone, depending on what was available locally. They were shaped into flat discs or squares, their surfaces smooth and sometimes slightly domed at the center. The stone was set into the platform carefully, its upper surface brought precisely to the correct level. This was important work. If the column bases were not all at exactly the same height, the columns standing on them would not be exactly vertical, and the beams resting on top of the columns would not be exactly horizontal, and the entire structure above would be thrown out of alignment. So the setting of each stone base was checked, and checked again. A long straight rod laid across two bases would reveal any difference in height. Water in a shallow channel would confirm the level. Tiny adjustments were made. A little more earth tamped beneath one side of a stone. A thin sliver of stone shimmed under a corner. When all the bases were set, the platform was ready. The wooden structure could begin. The forest and the timber. Ancient Chinese architecture was above almost everything else, an architecture of wood, while other ancient civilizations built primarily in stone, the Egyptians with their limestone and granite, the Romans with their concrete and marble, the Chinese built primarily in timber. This was partly a practical choice, reflecting the availability of forests in many parts of China, but it was also a philosophical one. Wood was considered a living material, connected to the natural world in a way that stone was not. Wood could be shaped and joined with great precision. It was flexible under stress in a way that made it resistant to earthquakes, which were not uncommon in many parts of China. The selection of timber for a major building was a serious undertaking. The forests where suitable timber could be found were sometimes far from the building site, in the mountains, in remote river valleys, in areas where the right species of trees grew to the right size. The most prized timber for building was from certain species of pine, cedar, and cypress. These were trees that grew slowly, their wood dense and fine-grained, resistant to insects and to rot. A tree suitable for a major structural beam might be many decades old, sometimes a century or more. Its trunk would be straight and true, without significant knots or twists, the growth rings tight and even. The selection was done by experienced craftsmen who knew wood deeply. They would examine the grain, the color, the weight of the timber. They would smell that good timber had a particular clean, resinous smell. They would tap it with a knuckle and listen to the sound it made, the way a musician listens to an instrument. Transporting the timber once cut, the timber had to be brought to the building site. This was often one of the most difficult parts of the entire construction process. Large timbers, the main beams for a significant building, might be 30 or 40 feet long and weigh thousands of pounds, could not be carried. They had to be moved. In mountainous terrain, logs were sometimes slid down hillsides on prepared chutes, channels cut into the slope, sometimes lined with smooth wood or packed with snow in winter, down which the logs would slide under their own weight, guided by workers with ropes. The sound of a large log moving down a mountain chute was a deep rushing sound. The wood against the earth, building speed. The workers at the bottom ready to slow it with ropes Before it went too far. Where rivers were available, they were used. Logs were floated downstream, sometimes lashed together into rafts, guided by workers on the banks or riding the raft itself with long poles to steer. A river carrying a raft of large timbers was a slow and patient process. The current did the work, but the workers had to be constantly attentive, preventing the raft from grounding on shallows or being caught on rocks. The final transport to the building site, where roads or rivers did not reach, was done with rollers, smooth logs placed beneath the timber, which was then pushed and pulled forward, the rollers being moved from the back to the front as the timber advanced. This was slow work measured in yards per hour, but it worked, and it required nothing more than the intelligence to understand the principle and the patience to execute it. The carpenter's workshop before timber could be used in construction, it had to be prepared. This happened in the carpenter's workshop, a large open area near the building site, equipped with the tools and the skilled workers needed to transform raw timber into the precisely shaped components of the building. The first step was squaring the logs. A freshly felled tree trunk is round, and buildings require straight, flat surfaces. The log was first marked with ink lines, snapped along its length using an ink-soaked string, the string held taut between 2 points, then plucked, leaving a perfectly straight line on the wood's surface. Then workers with adzes, a tool like an axe, but with the blade turned perpendicular to the handle, would work along the log, hewing away the curved surfaces following the ink line, gradually producing a flat face. 4 such operations, one on each side, produced a squared beam. The adze work was rhythmic and precise. The worker stood on the log or beside it, the adze rising and falling in a controlled arc, each stroke removing a thin chip of wood, the surface becoming flatter and smoother with each pass. The smell of freshly cut wood filled the workshop, a clean, sharp, slightly sweet smell that varied with the species of timber. After squaring, the beams and other components were shaped to their final dimensions with saws, planes, and chisels. The saw used in ancient China was often a frame saw, a blade tensioned in a wooden frame, used with a pulling motion rather than a pushing one. The plane smoothed surfaces to a fine flatness. The chisel, driven by a wooden mallet, cut the mortises, the rectangular recesses into which the tenons of other pieces would fit. The mortise and tenon joint was the fundamental unit of Chinese timber construction. A tenon was a projecting tongue of wood shaped to fit precisely into a mortise cut in the receiving piece. When fitted together, the joint was strong and tight, requiring no nails and no adhesive. It could flex slightly under load without breaking. It could be disassembled and reassembled if necessary. It was a joint of great intelligence and great practicality, and it was used throughout the structure of every significant Chinese building. The du gong, the bracket system of all the elements of ancient Chinese architecture. The most distinctive and the most technically remarkable was the du gong, the bracket cluster that mediated between the top of a column and the beams above it. The du gong was not a single piece. It was an assembly of many interlocking wooden components, bracket arms projecting outward in multiple directions, small blocks called dough fitting between the arms, each piece locking into the others through carefully cut mortises and tenons, the whole assembly building outward and upward. From the column top in a complex three-dimensional structure, the purpose of the do gong was to distribute the load of the roof, which was very heavy in Chinese architecture, outward and downward through the column to the foundation, but it also served to extend the eaves of the roof outward, beyond the line of the columns, providing a wide, deep overhang that protected the walls and the base of the building from rain. Making a do gong required great skill. Each of the many components had to be cut to precise dimensions, because the assembly only worked if every piece fit exactly. A single component slightly too large or too small would prevent the assembly from coming together correctly. The craftsmen who made do gong components worked slowly and with great care, measuring repeatedly, testing the fit of each piece before moving on. The finished do gong, assembled on top of a column, was a beautiful object in addition to a functional one. The interlocking arms and blocks created a pattern of projecting and receding surfaces, of shadows and highlights that was visually complex and satisfying. Looking up at the do gong brackets beneath a Chinese roof is one of the great visual pleasures of traditional Chinese architecture. The column was the primary vertical element of a Chinese timber building. Everything above the beams, the brackets, the roof ultimately rested on the columns, and the columns rested on the stone bases set into the rammed earth platform below. Chinese columns were not thin. A column for a significant hall might be 2 feet or more in diameter and 15 or 20 feet tall. It was made from a single trunk of timber, or sometimes from several pieces carefully joined. Its surface was smoothed and then, in most cases, painted red was the most common color for columns in important buildings, a rich, deep vermilion red made from mineral pigments. Mixed with lacquer or oil. Raising a column into position was a significant operation. The column, lying horizontal on the ground, had to be lifted to vertical and then guided onto its stone base. This was done with ropes and with the coordinated effort of many workers, some pulling ropes attached to the top of the column, others supporting the column at various points along its length, others guiding the base as it swung downward toward the stone. The foreman directing this operation had to be experienced and calm. The moment when a large column was swinging through vertical, its base descending toward the stone, was a moment requiring precise coordination. Too much rope tension on one side, and the column would swing past vertical. Too little, and it would not reach. The workers pulling the ropes would adjust their effort on the foreman's calls, and the column would come down slowly, until the base rested on the stone. Then it was checked for vertical. A plumb bob, a weight suspended on a string, was held beside the column at 2 orientations, 90 degrees apart. If the string hung parallel to the column's surface in both orientations, the column was perfectly vertical. If not, it was adjusted, the base shifted slightly on the stone until the plumb confirmed it was true. Beams and cross beams. Once the columns were standing, the beams could be placed. The main beams of a Chinese timber building spanned between columns, resting in the do gong bracket assemblies at each end. They were the largest and heaviest pieces of wood in the building. A major beam for a significant hall might be 30 feet long and 2 feet square in cross-section, weighing several tons. Lifting such a beam to the top of the columns was a considerable engineering challenge. Ramps of earth and timber were sometimes constructed to allow the beam to be slid upward gradually. Rope systems with pulleys multiplied the available force. Teams of workers pulled in coordinated effort on multiple ropes, the foreman calling the pace. The beam rose slowly, a foot at a time, the ropes creaking under the load. The workers pulling in unison, then holding while the ropes were reset for the next pull. The beam swinging slightly as it rose, guided by workers with long poles who kept it from moving too far in any direction. When the beam reached the right height, it was guided sideways until the tenons at each end aligned with the mortises in the dugong brackets. Then it was lowered carefully, the tenons entering the mortises, the beam settling into place. A deep, solid thud as the full weight of the beam came to rest in its brackets. Above the main beams, shorter beams were placed, and above those, shorter still, a series of progressively shorter beams stacked one above the other, each supported on short posts standing on the beam below. This system, called the chuan-do or tai liang frame, depending on the regional style, built upward toward the ridge of the roof in a series of steps, each level shorter than the one below, the whole structure rising like a mountain toward the central ridge. The highest point of the timber frame was the horizontal beam running along the very top of the building. At the apex of the roof dot, the placement of the ridge beam was often a moment of ceremony. In important buildings, the raising of the ridge beam was marked by a celebration. Food was prepared. Workers were given wine. Prayers were offered to the gods and spirits who would protect the building. A piece of red cloth might be tied to the ridge beam before it was raised. Coins or other auspicious objects might be placed in the mortise before the tenon was fitted to bring good fortune to the building and to the people who would live or work within it. The ceremony recognized what the workers understood very well, that the raising of the ridge beam was the moment when the building structure was complete. Everything below it had been preparation. Everything above it would be the enclosure, the walls, the roof covering that turned the frame into a building. But the frame itself, the skeleton of timber that would carry all loads and give the building its shape, was complete at this moment. After the ceremony, work continued. But there was a quality of satisfaction in the air on the day the ridge went up. Something accomplished, something that had existed only in drawings and in the minds of the craftsmen now standing before them, solid and real in the landscape. The roof frame, the roof of an ancient Chinese building, was not a simple inclined plane. It was a complex curved surface, concave in profile, meaning that it curved upward at the eaves, creating the characteristic upswept appearance that is one of the most recognizable features of traditional Chinese architecture. This curvature was achieved through the careful positioning of the purlins, the horizontal members running parallel to the ridge, supported by the short posts on each successive beam level. Each purlin was set at a slightly different height than a straight line. Interpolation between the ridge and the eaves would suggest. The outer purlins were set a little higher than they would be in a straight roof. This lifted the eaves, creating the upward curve. The degree of curvature varied by building type and region. Northern Chinese architecture tended toward more gentle curves. Southern Chinese architecture, particularly in regions like Fujian and Guangdong, developed more dramatic upswept eaves, the corners of the roof rising sharply upward into pointed tips that reached toward the sky. On top of the purlins, the rafters were placed slender timbers running from the ridge down to the eaves, parallel to each other and evenly spaced. Each rafter was shaped slightly differently from its neighbors because the curved roof surface meant that rafters at different positions along the building's length had slightly different profiles. This required careful calculation and careful cutting. The rafter work was precise and repetitive, setting each rafter in its place, checking its alignment, nailing or pegging it to the purlins. The sound of mallets driving wooden pegs over and over, steady and unhurried. The roof frame gradually filling in, purlin by purlin, rafter by rafter. Roof tiles, the roof covering of most significant buildings in ancient China, was ceramic tile. Chinese roof tiles came in two basic forms. The flat tiles, called pan tiles, formed the main surface of the roof, their flat surfaces overlapping like scales on a fish, each tile covering the joint between the two tiles below it. The round tiles, called tong tiles, ran in rows down the roof, their curved undersides resting in the valleys between rows of flat tiles, their upper surfaces forming raised ridges that shed rainwater efficiently. The tiles were made from clay, the same clay used for pottery and for bricks, dug from river banks and clay deposits, prepared by working it to remove stones and air bubbles, and then shaped. Roof tiles were shaped over a curved form, a section of bamboo or a wooden mold that gave them their characteristic profile. The shaped tile was then removed from the mold and set aside to dry slowly in the shade. Drying too fast caused cracking. The tiles had to dry slowly and evenly, which meant they were kept out of direct sun and wind during the drying process, sometimes covered with damp cloth to slow the moisture loss. When dry, they were loaded into the kiln and fired at high temperature, the same basic process used for pottery, but on a much larger scale. A significant building required thousands of tiles. The tile-making operation for a major construction project was a substantial undertaking in itself. Teams of workers preparing clay, shaping tiles, drying them, firing them, sorting the finished product for quality. Tiles with cracks or warps were rejected. Only tiles of consistent size and shape were used, because irregularities in the tiles would create gaps in the roof covering, through which rain could enter. Laying the tiles. Once the rafter frame was complete, the tiles could be laid. The first step was to create a base for the tiles. A layer of mud mortar clay mixed with water, and sometimes with chopped straw for reinforcement, was spread over the rafters. Into this mud, the flat pan tiles were pressed, their lower edges overlapping the upper edges of the tiles below, their sides touching the sides of adjacent tiles. The mud mortar held them in position while it dried and also helped to seal the joints between tiles. The tiling proceeded from the eaves upward toward the ridge. The first row of tiles was set at the very edge of the eaves, their lower ends projecting slightly beyond the last rafter to create a clean drip edge. Each successive row overlapped the row below by a third or half the tile's length, ensuring that no joint was exposed to the direct flow of rainwater. The round ridge tiles were set last, running in rows from eave to ridge, their curved forms nestling in the valleys between the rows of flat tiles. At the ridge itself, Special ridge tiles were laid larger, heavier tiles that capped the apex of the roof and sealed the junction between the two roof slopes. The corners of the roof, where the two slopes met at each end, were finished with special decorative tiles. On important buildings, the corners of the roof were adorned with carved ceramic figures, small animals arranged in a row along the hip of the roof. These figures, a rider leading a procession of animals including dragons, phoenixes, and various mythical creatures, were both decorative and functional, their weight helping to hold the corner tiles in place. The number of figures indicated the importance of the building. The most important buildings had the most figures. The completed tiled roof was a beautiful thing. The gray or deep green of the fired ceramic against the red of the painted timber below. The regular rhythm of the tile rows, interrupted at the ridges by the round forms of the tong tiles. The slight upward curve of the eaves at each corner, lifting the edges of the roof toward the sky. Walls of brick and earth, the walls of ancient Chinese buildings were not structural in the way that Western masonry walls were structural. Because the timber frame carried all the loads of the building, the weight of the roof, the forces of wind, the walls were needed only to enclose the space, to keep out wind and rain, to provide privacy and security. They could be thin. They could have large openings for doors and windows. They could even be removed or relocated without affecting the structural integrity of the building. This understanding that the frame carries the load and the walls are simply enclosure gave Chinese architecture a flexibility that Western masonry architecture did not have. Rooms could be opened or closed, enlarged or reduced by moving walls. Buildings could be expanded by adding additional bays to the timber frame. The most common wall material was brick. Chinese bricks were made from fired clay rectangular blocks, typically about 10 inches long and 5 inches wide and 2 inches thick, uniform in size and carefully fired to a consistent hardness. They were gray in color, the natural color of the fired clay, and their surfaces were smooth and slightly glossy where the kill's heat had begun to vitrify the outer layer. Bricklaying was careful, slow work. Each brick was set in a bed of lime mortar, a mixture of slaked lime and sand and water, white and sticky, spread in a thin, even layer on the brick below. The brick was placed, pressed firmly down into the mortar, tapped with a wooden mallet to seat it, and then checked for level and alignment. The mortar was allowed to squeeze out slightly at the joints, then scraped clean. The joints between bricks were staggered no. Vertical joint in one course was directly above a vertical joint in the course below. This interlocking pattern gave the wall its strength, tying the courses together so that the wall acted as a single unit rather than as a stack of separate bricks. City walls, the walls that enclosed Chinese cities were among the largest construction projects in the ancient world. A significant Chinese city was surrounded by a wall that might be 30 or 40 feet high, 20 or 30 feet wide at the base, and many miles long. The core of such a wall was rammed earth, the same technique used for building foundations, but applied at an enormous scale. The outer faces of the wall were protected by a skin of brick or stone, which shielded the earth core from erosion by rain. Building a city wall required the organized labor of thousands of workers over many years. The earth for the rammed core had to be dug, transported, and compacted. The bricks for the facing had to be made in vast quantities. The supervision of such a project required experienced engineers and administrators, capable of coordinating the work of many people over a long time. The ramming of the earth core was done in sections. Wooden forms, frames of timber that held the loose earth in place while it was rammed, were set up along a section of the wall line. Earth was brought in and spread in thin layers inside the form. Workers rammed it down, layer by layer, until the form was full. Then the form was moved to the next section, and the process was repeated. The sound of a large wall-building operation was extraordinary. Hundreds of workers ramming earth in unison, the deep thudding sound carrying across the construction site. The creak of the wooden forms under the pressure of the ramming. The calls of supervisors directing the work. The continuous movement of workers carrying earth in baskets, emptying them, returning for more dot as the rammed core grew in height. The brick facing was applied section by section. The bricklayers worked on scaffolding, a framework of bamboo poles lashed together with rope, built up alongside the growing wall, providing a platform at the right height for the work. Bamboo was ideal for scaffolding, light, strong, flexible, and available in long, straight lengths. A bamboo scaffold could be erected and moved quickly, and the same bamboo could be reused many times. The gate, every city wall had gates that controlled points of entry and exit through which all traffic passed. The gate was both a practical necessity and an architectural statement. It was the face the city presented to the world. A Chinese city gate was a substantial structure. The gate opening itself was an arched tunnel through the wall, the arch built from carefully shaped bricks, each one slightly wedge-shaped, the whole assembly locking together at the keystone at the top of the arch. Above the gate opening, a gate tower rose a multi-story timber building, built on top of the wall, its roof visible from a considerable distance, marking the position of the gate. The gate doors themselves were massive heavy panels of thick timber, often sheathed in iron or bronze, hung on iron hinges set into the masonry of the gate jambs. These doors, when closed, presented a surface that was essentially impenetrable to the tools of ancient warfare. When open, they swung back against the inner walls of the gate tunnel, held in place by iron brackets. The mechanism for opening and closing the gates was simple and effective. Iron rings set into the inner face of each door panel allowed a large wooden bar, the gate bar, to be slid across from one side of the tunnel to the other when the doors were closed, passing through iron brackets mounted on each door and through a central bracket mounted in the wall. This bar held the doors closed against any force pushing from outside. Removing it required only sliding it back, which could be done quickly from inside. The gatekeepers who managed this daily routine knew it by heart. The gates opened at dawn and closed at dusk. In the morning, the bar was removed, the doors were swung open on their heavy hinges, and the day's traffic began. Farmers with carts of produce, merchants with laden animals, travelers arriving from distant places. In the evening, the traffic slowed, the last stragglers hurried through, and the gates were swung closed again. The bar slid home, the city sealed for the night.
Managing water. Ancient Chinese builders thought carefully about water. Rain, groundwater, and flooding were constant concerns, and a well-designed building managed water at every scale, from the slope of the roof tiles to the drainage channels around the building platform to the broader management of water across the site. The slope of the roof was the first line of defense. A steeper roof sheds rain more quickly. The curved eaves threw rainwater outward and away from the base of the walls. The round ridge tiles channeled water into the valleys between them and directed it down the roof to the eaves in controlled streams rather than letting it sheet across the entire surface. At the eaves, the water fell to the ground. On an unprotected site, this would mean falling directly against the base of the wall, eroding the foundation. The solution was a band of stone or brick paving around the base of the building, a wide apron that caught the falling water and directed it away from the wall. This paving sloped slightly outward, so that water landing on it would flow away from the building rather than pooling against it. Beyond the paving, drainage channels were cut in the earth-shallow ditches that collected the water flowing from the paving and directed it away from the building site altogether, toward lower ground, toward a pond or a stream, or simply to open ground where it could soak away harmlessly. These drainage channels were not dramatic features. They were modest, functional, and unassuming, but they were thought about and executed with care, because water mismanaged was water that would eventually damage the building. A small drainage channel, properly placed, could protect a building for centuries. The well, water for use inside the building for cooking, for drinking, for washing, came from a well if there was no spring or stream nearby. Digging a well was skilled and sometimes dangerous work. The diggers worked downward through successive layers of soil and rock, the shaft narrowing as it went deeper, the workers below exposed to the risk of cave-in and to bad air. Wooden frames were set in the shaft as it was dug, preventing the walls from collapsing, and the excavated material was lifted out in buckets on ropes. When water was reached at a depth that might be 10 feet or might be 100 feet, depending on the local geology, the shaft was lined with brick or stone, the walls mortared to prevent contamination of the water. The well's mouth at the surface was finished with a stone or brick surround, raised slightly above the ground to prevent surface water from running in. The well covers a wooden lid that rested over the mouth of the well. When the well was not in use, kept debris and animals out of the water. A rope and bucket allowed water to be drawn up. The rope wound around a horizontal windlass, a simple mechanical advantage that made lifting a heavy bucket of water from a deep well manageable for a single person. The sound of drawing water from a well was quiet and familiar. The creak of the rope over the stone lip of the well. The splash of the bucket entered the water far below. The steady creak of the windlass as the full bucket was raised, the rope winding around the drum, the bucket rising slowly through the darkness of the shaft into the light. Lacquer. When the structure of a Chinese building was complete, the frame, the walls, the roof, the finishing work began. And the most important finishing material in traditional Chinese architecture was lacquer. Lacquer is the sap of the lacquer tree, a tree native to China that produces a milky, toxic sap when its bark is cut. This sap, when applied in thin layers and allowed to dry in conditions of controlled humidity, polymerizes into an extraordinarily hard, durable, waterproof surface. It can be polished to a mirror-like shine. It can be colored with pigments: red with cinnabar, black with iron compounds, gold with actual gold powder. And it adheres tenaciously to wood, protecting it from moisture, from insects, from the effects of time. Applying lacquer was slow, careful work. Each coat was applied with a soft brush in long, even strokes, spread as thinly and evenly as possible. A thin coat dried more quickly and more evenly than a thick one. When dry, the surface was sanded lightly with fine abrasive material, powdered charcoal, or fine sand wrapped in cloth to smooth any irregularities and provide a tooth for the next coat to adhere to. Then another coat was applied. A fine lacquered surface required many coats, sometimes 10, sometimes 20, sometimes more. Each coat dried completely before the next was applied. The drying happened slowly. In a room with controlled humidity, lacquer dried by absorbing moisture from the air. A process that is counterintuitive but true, and that meant that lacquer dried better in humid conditions than in dry ones. The final surface, after all its coats and all its sanding, was smooth as glass and deep as still water. The color was pure and rich. The surface was hard enough that a fingernail pressed against it left no mark. This was the surface that the craftsmen had worked toward, coat by patient coat, over many weeks. Painted decoration. The beams and brackets of Chinese buildings were often painted with elaborate decorative patterns, a tradition called saiwa, meaning colored painting. The patterns used in saiwa decoration were complex and carefully organized. The main beams were typically divided into a central panel and end panels, each with its own pattern. The central panel might contain a landscape painting, or a scene from history or mythology, or an abstract pattern of interlocking geometric forms. The end panels were typically filled with swirling botanical motifs, stylized lotus flowers, peonies, clouds, and vines, rendered in a decorative vocabulary that had been developed and refined over centuries. The colors used were mineral pigments mixed with a binding medium malachite for green, azurite for blue, cinnabar for red, orpiment for yellow, white lead for white. These pigments were ground to a fine powder on a stone grinding slab, then mixed with the binding medium glue made from animal hides, or a mixture of glue and alum to create a paint that was thick enough to cover well, but thin enough to apply with a brush. The painters who executed saiwa decoration were skilled specialists. They worked from pattern books, collections of established designs that had been refined over generations, but they also exercised considerable artistic judgment in the execution, varying the patterns to suit the particular proportions of the beam or bracket they were decorating. The brushwork required control and steadiness. Long, flowing lines had to be executed in single strokes, without hesitation or correction. The painter would hold the brush upright, moving their whole arm rather than just their wrist, the tip of the brush tracing the line with a confidence that only came from long practice. The garden. A Chinese building was rarely conceived in isolation from its surroundings. The garden or courtyard, in the case of urban buildings, was considered an integral part of the architectural composition, as carefully designed as any room inside the building. The Chinese garden was not a garden of straight lines and geometric beds. It was a garden designed to evoke the natural landscape, mountains, water, trees, rocks in a condensed and refined form. A garden of modest size might contain a small pond representing a lake, a pile of carefully selected rocks representing a mountain range, a path that wound around these features so that they were encountered gradually from changing angles, revealing themselves slowly to the person walking through the garden. The rocks used in Chinese gardens were a matter of great connoisseurship. The most prized rocks were those with complex, eroded surfaces, holes worn through them by water, channels and ridges carved by centuries of erosion, surfaces textured and irregular in a way that suggested great age and the action of natural forces. Such rocks were sought out in specific locations known for producing them: certain lake beds, certain limestone regions where the rock was shaped by water into forms of great beauty. Transporting a large garden rock from its place of origin to a garden in a distant city was an undertaking comparable in difficulty to transporting large timbers. The rocks were moved on carts, on boats, lifted with ropes and levers, set in place with extreme care. The positioning of a single important rock in a garden might be adjusted many times before it was considered right, turned slightly this way, tilted slightly that way, raised or lowered by changing the bed of earth beneath it. Trees were planted with equal care. The pine, the bamboo, and the flowering plum were the three most prized plants in the Chinese garden, known as the three friends of winter, because they remained green or bloomed even in the cold season. A pine planted in the right position, its branches extending over a rock or overhanging a small pond, created a composition that was both natural and deliberately arranged, a balance that was the essential quality the Chinese garden sought to achieve. Scale and order. The palace complexes of ancient Chinese emperors were not single buildings. They were cities within cities, vast enclosed compounds containing dozens or hundreds of individual buildings, arranged according to strict principles of hierarchy and symmetry along a central axis. The central axis ran from south to north. The most important buildings, the great halls where the emperor received officials, conducted ceremonies, and governed, were placed directly on this axis, facing south, with their main doors opening toward the south gate. Less important buildings were placed to either side, symmetrically arranged on the left and right of the axis, their importance diminishing with their distance from the center. This axial arrangement was not merely aesthetic. It expressed in architectural form the order of the universe as understood in ancient Chinese thought, the emperor at the center, the cardinal directions organized around him, heaven above and earth below, everything in its proper place and proper relationship. The scale of the major halls was intended to be overwhelming. A great ceremonial hall might be 200 feet wide and 100 feet deep, its roof rising 50 feet above the platform on which it stood. The platform itself, the elevated base of rammed earth faced with marble, raised the hall above the surrounding courtyards, so that approaching the hall from the south, through successive gateways and courtyards, one was always looking slightly upward at the building ahead. The approach was designed to be experienced slowly. One walked through gate after gate, crossed courtyard after courtyard, each larger than the last, each with its own buildings and features. The journey was long and the destination was always ahead, elevated, its roof visible above the walls of the successive courtyards. By the time one arrived at the foot of the final platform and climbed the broad stone stairs to the hall, the experience of the journey had already prepared one for the scale of the building. The Forbidden City, the greatest surviving example of ancient Chinese palace architecture, is the Forbidden City in Beijing, a compound begun in the early 15th century and built over a period of about 15 years by an army of craftsmen and laborers drawn from across the empire. The scale of the construction effort was almost incomprehensible. The timber for the major buildings came from forests in the southwest of China, hundreds of miles away, transported over mountains and along rivers over many years. The marble for the platforms and balustrades came from quarries near Beijing, carved and transported on sledges over roads deliberately kept wet and icy in winter to reduce friction. The bricks for the walls came from kilns set up specifically for the project, capable of producing the millions of bricks required. The roof tiles, golden yellow, the imperial color, were made in specialized kilns, their distinctive glaze achieved through a precisely controlled firing process. The workers who built the Forbidden City lived in temporary settlements around the construction site. They worked in organized groups under the supervision of master craftsmen. The carpenters, the bricklayers, the tile makers, the painters, the lacquer workers, each group had its own masters, its own apprentices, its own standards of quality. The work was inspected regularly, and substandard work was required to be redone. What resulted from all this effort was a complex of nearly 1,000 individual buildings, enclosed within walls nearly a mile long on each side, separated from the city beyond by a wide moat. The buildings of the inner court, the most sacred and private areas of the palace, were accessible only to the emperor, his family, and the court ladies and eunuchs who served them. Even high officials might spend their entire careers in the outer court without ever entering the inner sanctum. Maintaining the palace. A palace of this scale required constant maintenance. Wood and ceramic, exposed to weather over decades and centuries, required regular attention, repainting, retiling, replastering, replacing timbers that had begun to decay. The craftsmen responsible for palace maintenance were a permanent institution, employed generation after generation in the same work. A painter's son would learn his father's trade. A tilemaker's daughter might marry into a family of bricklayers. The knowledge of how to maintain these buildings, the specific pigments used for the tsaiwa decoration, the specific clay for the imperial yellow roof tiles, the specific lacquer formulas for the columns, was accumulated over generations and passed down within these craftsman families. Periodic large-scale renovations were also undertaken when the accumulated decay had become significant. These were major construction projects in their own right, entire roof sections stripped and retiled, decayed timbers replaced, surfaces repainted from scratch. The renovation craftsmen worked from the same principles and often from the same pattern books as the original builders, maintaining the visual continuity of the complex across centuries of change. Bridges. Ancient China developed a remarkable tradition of bridge building not only for practical reasons, but because bridges were considered architectural objects in their own right, worthy of the same care and skill as any building. The simplest bridges were flat, a single stone slab, or a series of stone slabs, resting on stone piers in the water. These were found everywhere in the Chinese countryside, crossing streams and irrigation channels with minimal means. The stone slabs were often several feet wide and thick, capable of carrying the weight of a loaded cart. Their surfaces were sometimes slightly roughened or ridged to prevent slipping in rain. More ambitious bridges used the arch. The Chinese masonry arch, built from carefully shaped wedge-section bricks or stones, locked together by their geometry, could span considerable distances. The famous Zhaozhou Bridge, built in the late 6th century, spanned nearly 90 feet with a single segmental arch, one of the largest stone arch bridges in the world at the time of its construction, and still standing today after 14 centuries. Building a stone arch required a temporary structure, a timber form, called a centering, shaped exactly to the curve of the intended arch. The stones were placed on this centering, working from each end toward the center, until the final stone, the keystone at the crown of the arch, was fitted into place. At that moment, the arch became self-supporting. The centering could be removed, and the arch would stand on its own, the geometry of its curved form transforming the vertical loads into horizontal thrust, which was resisted by the abutments at each end. The removal of the centering was a moment of uncertainty and of trust. The builders had calculated not in the modern mathematical sense, but through experience and through a deep intuitive understanding of how arches behaved, that the arch would stand. And it did. The centering came down, the arch stood, the bridge was complete. The pagoda. The pagoda is perhaps the most distinctive architectural form to emerge from ancient China, a tall, multi-storied tower, each story slightly smaller than the one below, with a projecting roof at each level, rising to a pointed finial at the top. The pagoda had its origins in the Indian stupa, a domed reliquary mound built to house sacred Buddhist relics. As Buddhism traveled to China along the Silk Road in the first centuries of the Common Era, the stupa was absorbed and transformed by Chinese architectural tradition, gradually evolving into the multi-storied timber or masonry tower that we recognize today. Early Chinese pagodas were built from timber, using the same post and beam construction as other Chinese buildings, but stacked vertically to create multiple stories. Later pagodas were built from brick, a material that could achieve the height and permanence that timber structures sometimes could not, and that was also more resistant to the fires that periodically destroyed timber buildings. A brick pagoda was built from the ground up, story by story. The walls of each story were thick, sometimes 6 or 8 feet of solid brick to carry the weight of the stories above. The interior of each story might be a single room, accessible by steep internal stairs, or the pagoda might be solid, without interior access, a pure external form. The eaves of each story, the projecting roofs that gave the pagoda its characteristic silhouette, were made in brick as well, corbelled out from the wall surface course by course, each brick projecting slightly beyond the one below, the whole assembly gradually building outward and downward to form a curved overhang that mimicked the timber eaves of conventional Chinese buildings. Viewed from a distance, a tall pagoda rising above trees or above the lower buildings of a monastery was a powerful vertical accent in the landscape, a marker visible from miles away, a point of orientation, a physical embodiment of the aspiration toward the heavens that the Buddhist tradition expressed. The pagoda rose from the earth, story by story, each story slightly smaller, the whole form tapering toward the sky, as if reaching upward toward something above. After the workers leave, at the end of a working day on a construction site in ancient China, the tools were put away and the workers went home. The tools were not simply left wherever they had been used. Each tool had its place, the chisels wrapped in cloth and stored in their wooden box, the saws hung on pegs, the planes set on a shelf with their blades down to protect the cutting edge. A craftsman who did not care for his tools was a craftsman who would soon have tools that did not work. And tools that did not work produced work that was not good. The construction site itself settled into quiet. The ropes were coiled. The scaffolding stood, empty of workers, its bamboo poles gleaming slightly in the last light. The timber frame of the building under construction stood against the evening sky, its columns and beams forming a geometry of verticals and horizontals that was not yet enclosed, not yet finished, but already expressing the form and the scale of what it would become. The evening light on a timber frame was beautiful. The wood, still pale and fresh cut, caught the warm light and seemed almost to glow. The shadows of the beams fell across each other, creating a complex pattern of diagonals on the ground. The dogong brackets at the top of each column cast small precise shadows, each arm and block defined by the low angle of the light. The building in rain. Rain on a construction site was not welcomed. Rammed earth work had to stop. Adding wet earth to a rammed foundation was counterproductive, the moisture preventing proper compaction. Timber work that was already done had to be protected. Unfinished wood exposed to repeated wetting and drying would check and crack. The workers covered what they could with large sheets of woven bamboo matting or with oiled cloth, pulling these covers over the exposed timber surfaces before they left in the evening if rain was expected. The matting was heavy and awkward to handle, but it was effective. Water beaded on its surface and ran off rather than soaking through. Rain on a finished tiled roof, however, was a different thing entirely. The tiles, set in their overlapping courses, shed the water efficiently. The sound of rain on a clay tile roof was a particular sound, a continuous, even percussion, the drops hitting the hard ceramic surface and bouncing slightly, the water running in thin streams down the channels between the round ridged tiles, gathering at the eaves and falling in a curtain to the paving below. This sound, rain on tiles, was one of the most familiar and most comforting sounds in a Chinese domestic environment. It meant the roof was working. It meant the building was doing what it was designed to do. It meant that inside, where the floor was dry and the lamp was lit, the rain was simply a sound present and acknowledged but not threatening. The building at night. At night, a Chinese building settled into itself. The great beams above the ceiling, invisible in the darkness, held the weight of the roof as they had held it through all the days and nights since they were placed. The mortise and tenon joints, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds in a large building, held each piece of the frame in its relationship to all the other pieces. The rammed earth platform beneath the floor tiles held the columns on their stone bases. Everything was in its right place, held by the intelligence of the design and by the skill of the craftsmen who had executed it. The lacquer on the columns was smooth and cool to the touch in the night air. The painted decoration on the beams, the swirling botanical patterns, the landscapes, the mythological scenes was invisible in the dark, but present, waiting for the morning light to reveal it again. In the courtyard outside, the garden was quiet. The pine tree stood still, its branches holding their permanent position. The garden rocks, placed with such care, sat in their positions of studied naturalness. The pond, if there was a pond, reflected the stars. The building had been constructed to last for generations. The craftsmen who built it, who rammed the earth, who shaped the beams, who set the tiles, who applied the lacquer coat by patient coat, had understood this. They had worked not for the immediate present, but for the long future. The care they had taken was a kind of gift, extended forward in time to all the people who would live within the building after them. And the building stood, through the night, through the seasons, through the years, holding its shape, holding its purpose, holding the effort and the skill and the patience of the people who had made it. And so we come to the end of our journey through the architecture and construction of ancient China. We have moved through it slowly, through the choosing of the site and the preparing of the ground and the patient ramming of the earth, layer by layer, until it was as hard as stone. We have been in the carpenter's workshop and heard the sound of the adze and the saw. We have watched the columns rise and the beams be placed. We have seen the roof tiles set, course by overlapping course, and the lacquer applied, coat by patient coat. We have stood inside the great halls of an imperial palace and felt the weight of the roof carried overhead by timber and by geometry. We have seen bridges spanning water and pagodas rising toward the sky. We have heard rain on tiles and seen evening light on fresh-cut wood. All of this was made by human hands, by thousands upon thousands of workers and craftsmen, most of whose names are not recorded anywhere. They rammed the earth. They shaped the wood. They laid the bricks. They painted the beams. And they left behind, in the buildings that have survived to this day, a permanent record of their skill and their patience and their care. There is nothing more to think about tonight. The work is done. The building stands. The roof keeps out the rain. The walls keep out the wind. Let your breath slow. Let your body grow heavy. Let the images dissolve the timber frame, the rammed earth, the tiled roof, the garden in the evening light. There is only the quiet now, and the dark, and sleep. Good night.